Hi, this is Susabelle from Patchwork Chicken Studio, and I thought I'd film a little tutorial about how I make our reusable microwave popcorn bags. So these are great, and they make great gifts for Christmas stocking stuffers, for the kid going away to college, teacher gifts, really great for teacher gifts. It's a simple little project. Almost anybody can do this if you have some basic sewing skills. And I'm going to start by telling you to pick something pretty for your fabric, because if you're going to do this, you might as well make it fun. I'm using a pretty wild fabric that is chickens in space, chickens and eggs in space. I thought it was hilarious and I bought it, but you can use anything you like. You can even theme it to whoever you're making it for. You will need 2 pieces of fabric, and they do have to be 100% cotton. And you want one that's patterned, and you want one that is just plain. And I just use plain old white cotton muslin for the inside of the bag, but you could go with a contrasting fabric or even a contrasting print, because I make these to sell. I do them in bulk. I do a lot of them, and so I just use the white muslin. It'll also, then you know when it's dirty and needs to be washed. So I do iron my fabric before I cut it to make sure it is actually the right size. You don't want it to be off-sized or, end up being not square when you're done doing it. So this is a piece of fabric 22 inches long and 10 inches wide, and that's both of the pieces here. And you're going to start by putting these right sides together, which of course on the white fabric doesn't matter, but on your pretty fabric you want it to be face down. You want to line up those edges. Now you can pin this. A new sewist should probably pin. I don't need to pin. I sew so much all the time, I really don't need to do that. As you're stitching around the edge here, you're going to notice that you're a little bit off. Sometimes a corner is up a little bit or just slightly off, but that's okay. We're not perfect. We're not robots. And so things are going to come out the way they come out. The other thing you need to notice is the direction of your print. So when you cut your fabric, you want to make sure your print goes the right direction. So I make sure mine is up and down the long way, so that my print will be right side up and not sideways when I stitch the whole thing together. The other thing is you want to know where the top is. So the top is where it's facing up here at the top, because this is where I'm going to leave an opening to turn the bag. If I put it on the bottom, the closing stitching shows. And so I want to make sure I leave my opening on the top. So what we're going to do is we're going to stitch around this entire rectangle, and we're going to leave about a 2-inch or 3-inch spot here in the middle of the top that is not stitched. That's where we're going to turn it right side out. So I'm going to sew this with a 1/4 inch seam, and my presser foot is 1/4 of an inch from the center of the needle to the edge of the fabric. So I don't need a seam guide, but you can use a seam guide if you need to. I'm going to go ahead and stitch around this, leaving that opening up here at the top so we can turn it. Okay, so we have our rectangle all stitched, and I have my opening up here. And I'm not going to turn this yet. What I want to do is to make it a little easier for my corners to be nice and flat. So I need to poke out my corners. And the way to do that is to make it better is to use a pair of scissors and just cut a little triangle off of the corners. So you can see I cut that triangle off. I did not get into my stitches, okay? You don't want to cut through the stitches or you'll create a hole as opposed to making your corners look good. So I will trim all 4 of my corners before I turn this right side out. So now when I turn these corners, they're going to get nice and sharp. So I'm going to use my little hole that I left in the stitching to turn this right side out. And you don't need much of a hole to do this. Like, your whole hand doesn't need to go in here. Whole hand is nice sometimes for some projects, but there's no reason for it for this one. I'm going to go ahead and put my fingers all the way down. I'm just using my 2 fingers and grab that bottom and just pull it out through this hole. And this doesn't take very long, and this is lightweight fabric. If you were using something thicker, you'd have to have a bigger hole for sure. But I'm going to get this all turned right side out. And then what I want to do is to again put my fingers back in here, and I'm going to find those corners, the ones that are on the far end first. And I'm going to poke those out. I'm just going to use my fingernail. You can also use a chopstick or a dull knitting needle, like a wooden knitting needle, and we're going to use the knitting needle here in just a minute. Whatever it takes. There's turning bones that'll do this. I just use my fingernail. So I'm going to poke those corners out, make them nice and square. And I'm going to do that for all 4 corners till I've got all my corners done. Now the next step here is to iron it. I'm going to press it, but I don't want to press it until I've really made this flat. So if I don't take some time, you can see this is like, if I just went to iron it now, there's a whole bunch of fabric folded up in there. I'm actually not, my seam isn't out. It's folded over with fabric, and that's going to make your bag smaller. It's going to make it lumpy, and it's not going to look right. So the next thing I have to do is to take a minute and poke these sides out really sharply. And I use this giant, and I mean giant, this is about 14 inches long, knitting needle, wooden knitting needle. And it has a little bubble on the end, but you don't need that. You just need something long. Chopstick will work, but you got to get your hand farther down in there. So I like this. If you run across one of these at the thrift store, pick it up. You will find so many uses. I have a pair of these. The one doesn't have its bubble, so it was like 50 cents. I bought them both, and I do use them. So I'm gonna put my knitting needle inside my hole, and I'm gonna go all the way down here to the bottom. And what I want to do is to push that needle, and I'm hoping you can see this, push that needle along that seam to kind of push that fabric out flat. And you don't have to do it very hard, but you just want to give it an idea of where you want it to be when you go to the ironing board. So I'm going to do that on both sides and the bottom, and I'm really just kind of just pushing that out so it will be flat when I go to the ironing board. Otherwise, you've got that fabric kind of layered over there, and you're not going to get a good crisp finish on your bag, and you're losing space too. And so you want it to be nice and square and consistent. So I'm going to push this out, and I just have to kind of work with it, and I'm kind of pushing right along the seam. And then I'm going to do the other side as well. Ooh, got some fuzz. So I'm going to go down here to the bottom. I already did the bottom, so I'm just trying to go up the side here to give it that kind of finger pressed, or at least to get it even. So when I do take it to the ironing board, it's going to be nice and crisp. So I'm going to do that here. And I don't want you to think that you can get away without ironing. Okay, ironing is the job I hate the least. I hate the most when I'm doing these projects, but it does make a difference in the way your product ends up. So up here is our opening. You can see that kind of here. What I want to do before I go to the ironing board is to fold those down and just kind of squeeze it with my fingers and make sure that that looks nice and even, which it does. Okay, so now I'm going to go iron this, and we'll go to the next step. Okay, so I finished ironing this, and you can see it's nice and crisp, and that's the way you want it. Up here at the top where that opening was, I did fold down that seam allowance and iron that, so that's where we're going to stitch next. We want to close this opening up, and this stitching here, if you want to use a matching thread, you can, but this is the only stitching anyone will see, and only when the bag is open. So I tend to just use white on everything and not worry about it too much. But we need to close this opening up. So this again will be a 1/4 inch seam. It can be even smaller. You can go very much on the very edge of it if you want to. and I'm just going to stitch just this top portion that has the opening. And there is no need to back stitch or back tack on this part. Seems like a silly thing that I would say that, but you don't need to. This actually gets trapped inside a French seam. So these sides get trapped inside a French seam. They're not going to come undone. When you sew in batches like I do and you sew to sell, you're looking for little corners to cut. And it seems like a silly thing to cut out 4 seconds or 5 seconds, but it adds up over time. So now I'm going to move my camera just a little bit, hopefully. So I want to talk about how we fold this to get the pockets on the bottom, kind of a box bottom on the bottom, and how we have the flap that folds over on the top. And so I have the written instructions. I showed you those at the beginning. But some people don't do as well with written instructions as they do by seeing. So I have my piece here laying face up. And what I want is for the side that was stitched closed to be on my left, and the side that didn't have to be stitched closed on the right. Okay? And I'm going to fold this over at the top, and I don't measure it, but if I'm going to measure it, it's about 3.5 inches. I do so many of these, I don't think about it anymore, but this is at about 3.5 inches of a fold over. And then I'm going to take this part, the part that we sealed up, and I'm going to overlap it by about 1.5 inches or so. I'm going to overlap it over this piece by 1.5 inches. And you will have to pin this part, otherwise your sewing machine will skew it all around when it is stitching. So I want to make sure this looks pretty straight across. And I'm going to pin this. And I'm going to pin it fairly far inside where I'm going to stitch. I'm going to be stitching along here, and I don't want to run into those pins. Now the next step, I'm going to go a little bit closer here. The next step is to create a box bottom. Well, I don't have time to cut corners and stitch it and all of that. You don't need that. We're going to do what's called a paper bag bottom. I think it has some other names, but paper bag is the one I've seen. So basically, what I'm doing is I'm folding up some fabric in there, about 1 inch, and you can see it folded up in there, right there. And I want to make sure it's even. I'm going to look at it and make sure I did a pretty good job. You can get out your ruler and measure. I eyeball a lot of things, but you don't have to sew that way. So I'm not saying you have to. Pins are our friend. And again, I'm going to go ahead and pin this. I'm going to make sure that I've trapped all the layers with my pin, because I'm going to have to sew across these edges, and they're kind of thick now because that seam is folded in there. So these are a little bit thick, so I want to have them pinned so they're not going to wiggle around too much when I sew it. So this is the last of the sewing for this bag. After this, we get to turn it right side out, and you'll get to see how it looks. So I'm going to sew, again, a 1/4 inch seam. You can go a little farther, maybe a 3/8 if you want to. A 1/4 seems to work just fine for me. I'm going to start in from the edge at the top by about 1/4 inch. And that's so I can do a back tack or a back stitch. I want to do that to lock this stitching because there's some stress on this seam. And there'll be stress on this seam down here. We're gonna back stitch this as well. We don't want any stress on seams where that thread is going to come loose just from people using the object that we're sewing. So I am going to back stitch up here at the top. And then here where I'm picking up that folded fabric, I have to kind of feed it in there. You may have to stop and lift your presser foot and make sure it goes under. It depends on your machine. So down here at the bottom, I'm also going to do a back stitch. So I've back stitched on the bottom and the top of these seams. Now we're going to do the other side, and in this case, that folded over part is actually on the bottom next to your sewing machine, so it's not going to give you as much grief going over it. Just kind of the way it is. So again, a 1/4 inch seam I am going to back tack here at the very beginning. Make sure everything's even as I'm going. I have a little bit of a bubble here. I'm going to fix that. There we go. And I'm going to back tack here. So now this is done. If you're not familiar with this type of a seam, it is called a French seam. And a French seam, the value of a French seam is that it's a double stitched. Okay, that's great if you're doing something that's going to need that's going to get messed around with, like a bag or you know, clothing, that kind of thing. You're putting it on and off. But the other thing that a French seam does is it encloses everything. So there's no raveling. There's no loose threads that are going to come off of this. There's no fabric that's going to ravel away because it's all trapped inside this stitching. That's a real value right there. So now I'm going to go ahead and turn it right side out. So I do the bottom part of the bag first, and here's where our little boxy bottom, our little wedge is there, and that so that the bag can expand when the popcorn is being popped inside the bag. And so there's the other one. So I've got two. You can see my characters are right side up. That's what I wanted, right side up. And then I'm going to go ahead and fold over the flap. And here we want to poke out those corners up at the top. And there is our popcorn bag. So these are super simple. That didn't take very long. I think if I were just making one by itself, it's probably a 20-minute project. It's not particularly a scrap buster because it does take a considerable length of fabric at 22 inches of fabric, but not a difficult project, and you probably have fabric in your stash that you can do this with. To use this bag, you put your raw popcorn kernels in the bag. I'll have a picture of our card at the end that'll show you just what the amounts are. No butter, grease, or oil goes in this bag. Nothing goes in the bag but the popcorn kernels. A fire would happen if you did the butter in the bag, so you don't do that. This is for popping healthy air-popped popcorn, which you can then add your stuff to in a bowl afterwards if you want to. Pops for about 2.5 or 3 minutes, however long your microwave works, and then this is done. You let it sit for at least 30 seconds before you open this, because the steam will come out and, you know, kind of melt the skin on your face, which you don't want. Once it's open, this bag then can be carried right to the couch, and you can have your popcorn snack there. You can use any kind of flavored salts, or lemon pepper is really good on homemade popcorn. If you want to use butter, you would pour the popcorn into a bowl and put the butter on it there, because you don't want any oil or grease on the bag. When they get dirty, you wash them. I generally turn mine inside out, shake all the popcorn dust out. I get several uses out before I need to throw it in the washing machine. So there you have it, popcorn bag.